And so as we come to chapter 8, we hear again this insistent echo of Moses' message. Whatever you do, do not forget God. And this call, if we can see it like that, this plea of Moses to this second generation standing on the threshold of the promised land, we see it began in chapter 4 and has been stated and restated in differing ways ever since. This is Moses's passion for these people, knowing he's not going with them. He wants them to know his heart. Please, please stand firm. And if we split this chapter 8 into two sections, then we see firstly, if we take verses 1 to 10, we see how Moses draws their attention to God's unfailing care, provision of bread, provision of water. And we see with this sort of the manna from heaven, Jesus in the New Testament, we see he claims to be the fulfillment of that. I am the bread of life, satisfying our spiritual hunger fully and completely, nothing of ourselves. The Israelites in the wilderness didn't work for this manna. They didn't go out and plant seeds and it grew. It was just there. And we see God's care runs through meeting so many of their needs. Their clothes didn't wear out. Their feet didn't swell up. And then we find tucked away in this chapter 8 and verse 3, this bit that Jesus in his temptation in the wilderness, he uses this to resist Satan. Jesus in the wilderness is encouraged to turn stones into bread. He's tempted to focus upon material provision. And Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, man does not live on bread alone. And we see here Moses reminds them that being fully human has or comes with a spiritual dimension. And he develops that in a moment. Who we are and how we are does not, must not simply consist on being grounded in what we have and what we have achieved. For we can only be truly ourselves when we acknowledge our need of God. Man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from God. And acknowledging this makes us, and Moses reminds the people, they can only be truly God's people when they are dependent fully upon him. And alongside this, in this first section, we also see that God humbles these Israelites through their wilderness experience to test them, to make them see and understand their complete dependence upon God. He's testing their faith, their trust. They must not take pride in their own achievement. And again, we'll see that developed into the second half of the chapter. And again, we see this as something, this theme is picked up and developed in the New Testament. Both Paul and James particularly come to mind. We face all kinds of trials, many and varied, but these are so that we might develop faith, trust, godly character. And that's exactly what Moses is saying to this second generation of Israelites too. And then in the second half, we see again the dangers of temptation. In chapter 7, we see that Moses talks about temptation as an external thing. Do not be led astray by the nations around you. And here in chapter 8, we see Moses develop this theme of temptation as now being something that can also be internal. Do not say to yourself, look at what I have done. And we see the temptation of prosperity, complacency, arrogance, and devaluing God. God is no longer required. I have done this. And Moses seeks to counter this by reminding them again, and we see it in the closing verses, particularly verses 14 to 16, God has done everything. He brought you out of Egypt. He led you through the wilderness. He brought you water from the rock. He gave you manna, and so on. God has met all of your needs. And there's this urge and urgency here that as they stand on the threshold of God's provision for them, that they must not forget everything has come from him. Look back and see what God has done, and look forward knowing what he has promised.